evening. I just wanted to confirm again, there's a recording in progress. So this program will be recorded and everyone who has registered will get a link and it'll also be posted on our webpage. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight for our program, A Discussion with Erik Rebain, author of Arrested Adolescence, The Secret Life of Nathan Leopold. I'm Ellen Keith, Chicago Collections Consortium Board Chair and the Director of Research and Access and Chief Librarian at the Chicago History Museum. For those of you who are new to our audience tonight, Chicago Collections Consortium is a consortium of libraries, museums, and cultural organizations, all working together for the preservation and promotion of Chicago's history and culture. We share our collections through our Explore portal, which provides free and open access to members' archival collections. We'd like to begin our program with Chicago Collections Consortium's land acknowledgement, statement, which reads, Chicago Collections Consortium acknowledges and is grateful for the Native peoples who laid the foundation for the city of Chicago and for the diverse indigenous nations that reside in Chicago today. When you visit our member organizations and when you experience Chicago's outdoor spaces, we invite you to join in offering respect and gratitude to the many indigenous peoples that reside in the Chicagoland region, as well as their ancestors. I'd like to thank CCC's donors, shown here, whose generous support allows us to offer unique free programming like this one being offered tonight, in addition to supporting our Explore Chicago Collections portal. We invite you to check out CCC's website to see a complete list of upcoming programming. I am at the end of my Wednesday night and losing my words, but I'm going to have Erik do all the talking. Tonight, I am honored to be speaking with Erik Rebain about his recent book entitled Arrested Adolescence, The Secret Life of Nathan Leopold. I know our time together is going to go by quickly, so we're going to get started. And just a reminder to our listeners that we hope to save time for questions at the end of the discussion, and those questions can be directed to our Q&A. So we're going to begin. So Erik, I have so many questions. So I know you've been researching the life of Nathan Leopold for some time. What drove you to this topic, and what are some of the unique discoveries that you found about Nathan and his case?
So I first heard about this way back in, I think, 2010, 2011, when I watched a documentary, and I was fascinated by the relationship between Leopold and Loeb. I didn't understand it. I wanted to know more about it and what would make two people do this, kind of thing. What was the second part of your question? Sorry, I lost it.
Sorry, what were the unique discoveries that you made when you were doing this research? And you've done a lot of research, which is really
So when I first got interested, it was kind of with the idea that Loeb is the bad guy and Leopold's the good one, and obviously they were both bad. They killed someone, but Leopold was less bad, and when he was in prison, he was a model prisoner. He really turned himself around. When he got out of prison, he was also, he did so much good work, just an all-around great guy. And then, as I did my research, I kind of discovered that was probably not the case. Just discovered a lot of things about his own philosophy, his continuing philosophy throughout his life, and things that he was doing and people he was taking advantage of. And so those are kind of new discoveries that I would say that I found.
What were some of the archival collections that you used? And to full disclosure, I know you've used CHM.
I 100 CHM and Northwestern are vying for the top spot of which is the most important Leopold and Loeb collection, because CHM, the Chicago History Museum, has Nathan's personal papers, over 50 boxes of material, mostly correspondence and things like that. And it was in your museum that I decided to write my book, because I had found the information that I thought was important enough that I needed to tell it. So that's an incredible resource. The other one is at Northwestern University, and that has the papers of Leopold's lawyer, Elmer Gertz. And so that's a complete, that's also trial transcript from 1924, psychiatric reports from 1924, the original ransom note, a lot of original documents from 1924, as well as correspondence Leopold's will, things like that, and photos and things, which was also obviously really important.
Mhm.
So a lot of the big collections are in and around Chicago, but I've gone, like, just yesterday, I digitally got stuff from the University of Texas.
Oh, cool.
I've gone physically to U of C Berkeley for someone who knew them in prison and did lie detector tests on them. I've gone to Johns Hopkins because there's letters that their lawyers wrote during the trial. Like, I've gone all across the country to look for material.
It's a really amazing, I mean, the bibliography and the sources cited are just, I mean, this is just an amazing piece of scholarship.
Thank you.
So I think you've touched on this a little, but I'm going to ask you just to think about it a little more. You know, who in your words was Nathan Leopold, and what do you hope readers learn from your book?
To me, and how Leopold identified himself, and I think it perfectly sums him up, is he was a hedonist. The most important person to Nathan Leopold was Nathan Leopold. He is a contradiction of a man. He's very complicated. He's extremely intelligent, and he can be generous and kind and thoughtful. He always remembers anniversaries, maybe a little too many anniversaries. He did a ton of charity work. He cared about like ecological conservation. He raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for hospitals and people in need. But at the end of the day, the most important person to him is him. And so he also took advantage of people. He was very self-absorbed. He was an incredible contradiction. And he only had empathy for people that he cared about. So for someone like Bobby Franks, his victim, I didn't see any empathy ever. I didn't see any remorse, didn't care. But if someone he cared about, if his family member got sick, he would be very upset, of course. He's just such a contradiction of a person. And I would hope in my book that people get to understand more the full picture, not just a totally evil criminal, sociopath, whatever, or, oh, he was just he was bad, but then he was good. And I would love if people had a more complex, version of him in their head.
No, I'll tell you, one of my early introductions to him when I started working at CHM was learning that he was a bird watcher and a birder, because we have the film, The Kirtland's Warbler.
Yeah. And that's beautiful. That is, yeah. So there's a film from 1923, the year before the murder, and there's film of him. There's film of him feeding a bird, and all his friends are with him, and they're feeding it too. And it's a quite rare, not a rare. Well, it's a rare bird. It's endangered. But the nesting sites were pretty unknown at the time. I think that was the third known nest that ornithologists had found, because they only nest in a very specific part of central Michigan, in trees that are a specific height, very difficult to track down the nests, and the nests are on the ground. It's a whole thing. But yeah, it's so cool. There is footage of him from that old, but it shows another side of him, and he raised a lot of birds. He would in prison, he would raise birds and carry the chicks in his pocket so he could feed them at regular times. And he had a lot of care for a lot of things, just not everything.
That's the way it was. So, we think about Leopold and Loeb, and I remember when Meyer Levin talks to him about compulsion, and then he does a lawsuit. And of course, I've watched Rope with Hitchcock. He's inspired so many theatrical things, books and theater and movies. And why do you think people are just so interested in this story?
I think it's because there's so many avenues that you can get interested in. Like in 1924, the overwhelming majority of people who were looking for something like, how did this happen? What's to blame for this, of how these two guys turned out, was overeducation, was secular education. And so that was a road in for a lot of people. That's why they were interested. universities, like not just the richest of the rich going to universities was new and it was scary. And there was also the Child Labor Amendment was passed in 1924. That also came up a lot in 1924 of like, they didn't have jobs as children. They didn't do hard work. So that's why they turned out like this. There's just so many ways in, and obviously nowadays we don't we don't get in that way, but it's like, how do wealth and that power and how it warps you and how it can influence justice when you get to the trial. There's also the Jewishness, there's the queerness, there's so many, and of course it's the 1920s. That's always fun. But yeah, there's just so many parts of this. Like, I know people who are only interested in birding, and they know this case because Leopold was a birder. And if you're interested in malaria, you've probably heard of this case because of because of the Nuremberg trials that happened because of malaria experiments that happened in Stateville that Leopold was a big part of. Like, there's just so many ways.
Yeah, I mean, it just touches on all of these things.
And I think for a lot of people, it's the Leopold Loeb. Like, what went on between them? Like, how does someone, do they influence someone else? How do two people come together and do something like this that they might not have done on their own? It's really, I think that sparks a lot of imaginations.
We talked about this briefly before we started the program, and now I'm going to put you on the spot again because I have prepared you. What do you think, if Loeb had lived, what do you think would have happened?
And as I said, but like, there's so many possibilities for if Loeb had lived. Loeb died in 1936, and Leopold was eventually paroled 20 years later. But he was paroled partially because he kind of talked down Loeb. And so the question is, what would have happened? If Loeb and Leopold were alive at the same time, would they have been able to get paroled? Would someone have seen like, oh no, you shouldn't be together? That's not usual, at least for the time period. Like, co-defendants got paroled all the time, but because it was such a popular case, you really never know what's going to happen with something like that. If Loeb had lived and Leopold had died before they were trying to get paroled, I think public perception about them right now would be totally switched. All of the fiction would be different, because it was Loeb dying in a way that the public saw as this, that Loeb was trying to rape someone else, that he had all this power in prison. It just really blackened his reputation. And then Leopold furthered that as he was trying to get paroled. So if you don't have those two, actually back in 1924, people thought Leopold was the worst one. So I think that if Loeb was alive, oh my gosh, I think people would see him as much better than Leopold.
And I think from your book, which again, of course, is focused on Nathan Leopold. I mean, I'm going to say this the wrong way. He was almost sort of the more interesting of the two. I mean, just in terms of his variety of interests that didn't Loeb just didn't come across that way as much.
Well, it's hard because with
dead.
Leopold, I have so much material, thousands and thousands of letters. And Loeb, I think I have maybe 20 letters that I've seen from Loeb. I don't know Loeb. So he could be fascinating. I have no real understanding of him, which is the unfortunate thing. When I was originally starting, I wanted to do either a dual biography, like with both of them, or two, like one for each. But I just don't have enough for Loeb, So, but yeah, I don't know if he's uninteresting. Maybe he could be the most interesting man in the world.
Not meaning to put it that way. I think there's just so much in Leopold's, again, the birding, the languages,
No, I agree. I agree. Loeb does seem more like normal. Like, he did normal college boy things. He went out gambling and drinking, and it's just, I mean, Leopold did too, but like, that's kind of seems like that's what, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I veered wildly off of our the questions that we shared with you. Here, okay, so back onto those. What unanswered questions do you have about Leopold's life?
Oh, so many. I mean, I still don't understand what the relationship was between he and Loeb. I don't even know how they met. I don't know how they became friends, how they became close. When Leopold confessed that he was gay to Loeb, while they were on a train going to Loeb's vacation home,
Mhm.
why that you had to have been pretty confident in yourself
Mhm.
to do that in the early 1920s in a train when you're going to be isolated 7 hours from home, like with
Mhm.
the person that you confessed to. What was the thought process there? But there's a span of time in the 40s in prison that I have very little information about.
Mhm.
Really, everything early prison from like 1953 before, I really don't have a lot of information. I There's just so many things where it's like I want to sit him down and just, you have to tell me the truth, okay? Just tell me these things. I would love to know what he actually thought about the murder. Did he think about it that often? You know, did he ever feel remorse? I would love to know. Because I can't
Yeah.
trust what he says. You
Mhm.
know, I tend to think he didn't feel remorse because of what
Mhm.
he doesn't say.
Right.
Because after he got paroled, he never talks about it again except to make jokes, which to me doesn't seem like he cares. But yeah, there's so much you can infer from reading people's letters and things like that. But there's so much that's still unknown. So,
Mhm.
and that's why I'm still researching to this day, honestly.
Um, so, you've talked about his time in prison. So what role did that play? I mean, that's significant period of time in what he was able to accomplish later in life. And while he certainly accomplished some good, the school and the participating in the malaria study willingly, he also really worked the system. So,
Mhm, mhm.
which side do you think was dominant?
See, that's such an interesting question because like he did he did work the system in his
Mhm.
favor. It started in prison. You can see very clearly what he does in prison later translates to what he would do when he was out of prison. It's like he does really good jobs. Like he worked in the library. He helped rebuild the library when it was burned down after a prison riot. And that was a huge service that the prison needed. He was really interested in doing that. He wanted an interesting project, but also it let him hire and fire. So he could hire his favorites, give them a
Mhm.
job, get them closer to him. It meant that he had certain privileges because he was the boss of something. It's the same thing with all of his prison activities. They would give him access to bathrooms, different, better food, like some privacy, yard access, like things like that. Um, and it's not that he did the jobs for those things, but they were nice perks,
Yes.
that he enjoyed. And it's the same thing that he did in Puerto Rico. Like
Mhm.
he started a charity fund that raised so much money to give to these people, and a lot of it did go back to the people he said it was going to, but a lot of it also went to his teenage boys that he was
Right.
having affairs with and things like that. So it's like he's able to, and all of those projects make him look great. Like there's such good publicity for him. They
Mhm.
give him status. They let him talk to the governor of Puerto Rico and all of these things. And he liked that aspect of it too. And it's just, when you ask what's dominant, I don't think you can even
Mhm.
divide it like that, because I don't think he saw like, my good side's winning today, I'll do some charity work. Oh no, I'm feeling bad, I think it's all just a mix of him, and that's, the good is with the bad. You can't divorce it with
Mhm.
him. Like it's just not how his brain
Yeah.
worked at that time. And I don't know, because I know less about what he was like before he was arrested. I
Mhm.
don't know if that's how his brain worked. I don't know if prison taught him that, you know?
Mhm.
But that was the pattern he continued on from prison until the rest of his life. So
I mean, yeah, and I'm thinking about it, like his scholarship was, and he had to have his name taken off of articles and things like that, but he was very interested in that sort of education.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he wrote articles before he went to prison, wrote them in prison, he wrote them after prison. He was engaged in that kind of thing. He wanted to get a doctorate because he wanted that status as well. He never
Yeah.
ended up getting it. He tried to get an honorary one several times. There was a college that almost gave it to him, but they backed down, which seems insane to me that anyone would even consider that. But
Do you know what college?
I think it was Lewis University. It was a religious university, and he lectured there because
Yeah.
he lectured at a lot of colleges. I
Huh.
think it was Lewis University. I would have to check that.
Okay.
But he was in talk with several,
Mhm.
trying to get him. And the church group who sponsored him to go to Puerto
Mhm.
Rico, the Brethren, they
Right.
were also working on it because they knew he wanted it. And it was just a whole thing.
Oh, I'm putting you on the spot again because we
Mhm.
hadn't talked about this question in advance, but I found his relationship with the Brethren so fascinating.
Mhm.
And just, somebody who's, an atheist and all of that, but then, takes this opportunity
Mhm.
and they really loved him.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's definitely, because I've talked to over a dozen people from the Brethren who knew him, and
Wow.
only one of them was like, and that was someone that he didn't get along with in Puerto Rico. That they had a lot of fights because Leopold didn't like the way he was running the hospital. That was a whole other issue. But like they genuinely accepted him. The Brethren are a peace church. They're all about forgiveness and like hate the sin, love the sinner, but not in like a really it's just like you did a bad thing, that's fine. Who are you now? And they took him at face value. And
Yeah.
they didn't, like, Brethren don't smoke, they don't drink, they don't dance. Leopold was a chain smoker and he drank and he put on these like the only thing I've seen him kind of reprimanded for by the Brethren was him throwing these elaborate charity things. Like he would have Sammy Davis Jr. give a concert, or the Supremes and things like that. And they're like, oh, this kind of fundraising is real. Do we want this tied in with the Brethren image? Not do we want Nathan Leopold tied in with the Brethren image? So it does seem like he genuinely respected them and he really appreciated that attitude towards him. And even though he wasn't religious, he was very interested in religion.
Yeah.
He studied a lot of religions. He led religious services. He read a lot of religious texts. So yeah, it's a fascinating kind of relationship there.
We've got a question. Have you thought about writing a novel to speculate on what you can't determine?
I used to write little short stories way back, maybe like 9 years ago. When I was just starting out with my research, I would use little short stories to like, okay, does this make sense? Like write it out and like, okay, here's a theory I have. Does this feel right? Does it feel wrong? Does it feel like a person might come to that conclusion? I haven't written fiction in a long time, but I love the fiction based on Leopold and Loeb. I love it, so I would love to contribute to that someday. So never say never, but I don't typically write fiction.
Okay. But never say never. We've got another good question. In Leopold's autobiography, he blames Loeb for being the one who killed Bobby Franks with a chisel. Do you think that Leopold expected that they would kill Bobby Franks or just kidnap him for the ransom?
Oh, no, I mean, just reading their confessions, he knew that they were going to kill him.
Yeah, they were. Yeah.
It was not an accident. It was not a surprise. That was what they went out to do that day.
You and I were talking about how they were not the masterminds they thought they were.
No, not at all. So many mistakes.
Oh, here's another good question. Do the archival collections contain reports from psychiatrists? And if so, what do they conclude?
So there's actually, let me see. there's like 10 or 11. There's so many psych reports in a lot of different archives. Most of them now are at Northwestern, but there's some at the University of Chicago. There's one that's at the University of Michigan that was restricted for 100 years, and it's opening in January, and I'm so excited. I gotta go see that one. And it's really fascinating because at first, so when they confessed, they brought psychiatrists in, and they made their initial, I think there was 4 of them, they made their initial recommendation, and they're like, they're insane. They couldn't tell reality from fantasy. They were clearly acting off of delusional thinking. They're insane. Then Darrow decided, well, we're not going to plead insanity. We're going to plead guilty. We're not going to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. We're pleading guilty. We're still going to use the psychiatric testimony. We're still going to use the psych reports, but we're going to try to mitigate that responsibility, but not plead insanity, because then that would bring in a jury, and he did not think a jury was going to buy that. And even if they did, they would have to go to an asylum, and it was not going to work. So then the psych reports changed. They brought in some more psychiatrists. They also used the same psychiatrists who then decided that they gave them like a whole list of diagnoses too. Like most of them don't exist anymore. Like dementia precox doesn't exist, and like split personality, of course, abnormal sexuality, things like that. They specifically don't use things like psychopath, which did exist. Like one of them described, they're like, the state psychiatrists are going to say that Loeb's a psychopath, but he's not, and these are the reasons why. So it's fascinating. They absolutely could not agree on what a diagnosis was.
And it's so, I mean, you know, as you said, it's like 100 years, almost 100 years ago, but it's that kind of thinking is really hard to read these days. I mean, it's so far from where we are, where we've been for the last several decades. It's just, boy, I mean, you know, and you're like, psychiatrists. It's really kind of scary.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Oh, here's another good question. If they had not been caught, do you think they would have done it again?
That is interesting. I think probably not, just because of the time frame. Well, like one, they wanted to do it because it was something, Loeb wanted to get away with a perfect crime and that kind of thing. And Leopold wanted to do everything once. I don't know if that was a huge motivator for him, but right after that, in June, Leopold was going to sail to Europe for 3 months. And then when he got back, he was going to be in Harvard. He was going to be like 12 hours away from Loeb. And so I don't know what Loeb would have gotten up to if he would have tried. I don't think he could have done it on his own. I don't think he would have wanted to. Would he be able to find someone else? Would he wait until Leopold came back? Would Leopold even move back to Chicago? There's so many unknowns there. And by the time they got back, they might have kind of been settling into like a more professional life. And they might have just kind of were like, it's not really something I care about anymore. I don't think they probably would have done it again, but not because I don't think they would have thought about it that much. I don't think it would have weighed on their conscience if they didn't get caught. I just don't think it would have interested them again.
That's really interesting. This is, another good question. And are there any members of the Franks family still with us? And if so, have there been any reaction to your book?
There are. The families tend not to like to talk very much, even though it has been a long time. There are some descendants of one of the Franks siblings. I've reached out to members of all of the families. The Franks did not want to talk, so I didn't push it. I haven't heard any reactions to my book from any of the families. I have heard a lot of reactions from people who knew Leopold. Or who knew the story, and some people are upset, like, why are you besmirching his bad name? And I'm like, please just read the book but some people, when they do read it, it's like, wow, I didn't know him. I thought I knew him and I didn't. And this is so fascinating. And I'm actually a lot of because they didn't know they were going to kill Bobby. There were a lot of potential victims that and a lot of children and grandchildren of those victims have actually contacted me, and they're like, oh my gosh, I thought I knew everything about this case and I didn't even know. And people who find their, their grandfather's name in the index or whatever, and they're like, what, he was connected to this? So it's been really cool to get those kinds of reactions. But
Yeah,
I don't want to push the family to talk if they don't want to.
understood. And it's interesting, just although it's almost 100 years ago, yes, there are so many people still around.
Mhm.
Oh, another good question. How many languages did Leopold speak fluently, and how many could he read and write?
I would say that's a tricky question. And I think it changed throughout his life because you pick languages up and then if you don't use them, they kind of go away. I think he could speak maybe 3 to 5 fluently. He could obviously speak German and English. He was raised in a bilingual household. He could speak obviously Spanish. He got along fine in Puerto Rico. French he could also, and possibly there's some other ones. I would say for reading and writing, anywhere from like, because he studied around 28 languages in his life, reading and writing proficiency, maybe 12, 15. I mean, I don't understand it. I'm not good with languages myself. And there's a lot of material of his that's in other languages, and he would mix them. Like if he didn't want someone to be able to read the notes he was taking, he would write them in like Sanskrit characters, but writing French, so that you would have to double like I can't decipher some of his notes still because they're written in this really weird mix of languages. And he succeeded in not being able to read his notes.
Oh, here's another question. So you mentioned going to college archives and the Chicago History Museum. Where else did you go for your research, and what kinds of documentation were you looking at?
Yes. So, I mean, as I said, I've been to like 50. Let's see. So the Illinois State Archives, incredible resource for prison material. That's you have registrars of the prisoners, their institutional jackets, which is anytime they got punished, there's just a huge wealth of material in there. There's mugshots, like that's and there's all the material for his parole attempts, his clemency attempts. That's all in there. And for a lot of, I also looked at a lot of people that he knew in prison, in that prison, to get background information on them. So that's an awesome archive as well. University of Chicago has a very small Nathan Leopold paper, collection of papers. It also has Bernard Glick's papers. He was one of the psychiatrists. So that's a lot of the psych reports that he created, and like 5 drafts of them in different states, and also handwritten notes. There's just so many. It's hard to even, a lot of it is like trying to find letters from people who knew them. Oh, it was really cool because I don't have a lot of Loeb letters, but I found some at the University of Michigan where Loeb went for 2 years. And there was him like writing to the registrar, like, hey, I'm coming from the University of Chicago. How many credits do I need? They're really boring letters, but it's for some, if you don't have a lot, it's cool. And I got transcripts from all the universities they went to. I don't know. There's just such a wide variety.
No, it's. I mean, again, if anyone looks at the book and the sources cited and all the producers, it's just amazing. Oh, another great question. Any insights on the story that Leopold learned Braille to read after lights out?
I don't have anything to contradict that. He did meet right after Loeb died, he was staying in the prison hospital in the detention cells. And a month after, a man who was blinded during a robbery, which is why he was sent to prison, got put there because they didn't know where else to put him. They just put him in the hospital and let him stay there. And he didn't know what to do. He had just been blinded, and Leopold, to give himself something to do when he couldn't work because he was in the detention cells, he couldn't leave the hospital. I think it was just kind of something that he wanted to take his mind off Loeb's death and his situation. And I believe that he did. He learned Braille to teach this blind prisoner. And then he just kept doing it.
Sorry, I'm thinking which other question to ask. I'm toggling between them. If this murder occurred today, how do you think the outcome of Leopold's life would be different, and would he ever obtain parole?
I think a lot of it would depend on if he got publicity.
Mhm.
If it was just another thing that you might read a few articles about and then the person disappears, I think he definitely would have gotten parole. Like if someone was just like, it was just one kid who got murdered, whatever, yeah, it's not like it was a serial killer. It's not like it was like a horrific ritual murder, something like that. It was a quite quick, you know, murder of one person. If there wasn't a lot of publicity, I think he would have just kind of gone through the system and gotten paroled eventually. But I can also see it being a media circus because they're still rich. That's still interesting to people. The gay part would have been played up way more, that this was about two people who were in a relationship. And nowadays it would be, was it video games? Was it movies? Was it, like
Yeah.
drugs? People would look at a lot of different things, but I can see people making, like sweet edits of them, like how people fall in love with the Columbine killers and things like
Right.
that. I can see that happening as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
Yeah, it all depends if the media caught on to them or not.
Mhm.
Because I think if that was the case, and they got their lighter sentence, they didn't get the death penalty
Mhm.
because at the time, anyone under 21 was considered a minor, and they
Mhm.
were 18 and 19 when they committed that crime. That's not a minor anymore.
Right.
And I think it's also possible they would have gotten one of those like 300-year sentences that they can never come back from.
No, that's a good point, because it was interesting. They kept calling them teenagers. I mean, the reporting called them teenagers, and that
And boys and
yeah.
yeah. But yeah,
Yeah.
at that time they were considered, yeah.
Mhm. Oh, another really good question. Could you please talk more about Leopold's Jewish identity?
Yes, so that was a really interesting part because I had not seen a lot of that talked about.
Mhm.
What really fascinated me, he was giving an interview to this guy in, I think, 1955 in prison. And he was talking about going to the University of Michigan, where he attended for a year. He and Loeb attended. And he said that was the first time that I had seen like anti-Semitism in like institutional anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
And he's like, he really connected more with his Jewish identity at that time. And there were, like he's like, I knew I couldn't join a white man's fraternity. And he specifically did not include himself,
Mhm.
because, and that's true. Like written into fraternity rules at the time, it was like you have to be Anglo-Saxon. You can't be these things. And
Mhm.
and so there were Jewish fraternities and there were white fraternities and there were mixed fraternities, but he's like, just that whole system like really disgusted him, and he stuck with the Jewish students. And
Mhm.
even looking at like, until he goes to prison, most of his friends, all of his girlfriends are Jewish. He really was steeped in that community. And then when he got to prison, he was way in the minority. There were not a lot of Jewish people
Mhm.
in Stateville at that time. And so it was like, it kind of and his family they were Reform. They
Mhm.
were into Reform Judaism, and they weren't super religious. Like they didn't celebrate Jewish holidays most of the time. They didn't observe these kinds of things, even though they went to temple sometimes. But he's like, in prison, I went to my first Jewish holidays, and he started studying Hebrew in prison to kind of get closer to that side. And
Mhm.
he would read the Torah, and it's really interesting kind of seeing him get more into that side of
Mhm.
himself in prison. It's
Mhm.
fascinating.
It really is. Oh, another really good question. How far did the publicity around the trial extend? To Europe or Asia, South America?
Yes, I have found newspapers well, not Antarctica, but every other continent. There are wire reports. They're not original reports, but in Germany, there's some original articles. In England, there's a lot. There was actually like the Illustrated Police News did these whole photo spreads of them, even though they didn't really, they're like, they drew them in like English style jails
Yep.
with them up in the witness boxes and everything. It's like, that is not what that looked like. But the publicity was really worldwide. I love looking at letters from people not connected to the trial, but who just were alive at the time. And they're in Russia, they're in Europe, they're all over the world, and they're commenting on this trial, and it was really worldwide.
Yeah. At Chicago History Museum, we have the Chicago Daily News photo collection, and they're just, it just feels like there are thousands of photos. Oh, another great question. How did Leopold's family deal with his crime? The prison visits, the post-parole meetings, etc.
That is also something I would love to know more about. Because the letters, I have very few letters from those early times. From what Leopold says, and what I can kind of glean, is that the early visits were very positive. It was just like, Leopold talks about what he's doing in prison, his family gives him the updates, and they just go from there. And there was actually a really fascinating letter from Loeb's mother, right, like after they confessed, and writing to one of her other children and just saying, like, Babe and Dick, which is their nicknames of Leopold and Loeb, she's like, Babe and Dick are sick. This wasn't, they weren't in their right minds. It's gonna take a while for like them to get better, but they're going to. And I don't know if all the members of the family looked at it as, they're sick and they're gonna go away and they're gonna be safe and everybody else is gonna be safe. And it's just like, it wasn't their fault. We're just gonna keep going. I don't see a lot of, I know the member of Leopold's family who had the biggest problem with it was his brother Sam. He really struggled with the shame and how to have a relationship with Leopold. They already didn't like each other before the murder, and this did not help. And when he started thinking about parole, it was very like, is this gonna be okay? Like, I love you, I want to support you, but are you actually safe? And I'm trying to be supportive, but I'm a little bit worried, but they did, like, he talks about his brothers bringing their wives in to meet him in the prison visiting room, and eventually their children. And after prison, like, they wrote letters all the time, him and his brothers. And they came to visit him in Puerto Rico. He came to visit them. He stayed at one of his brother's houses all the time. So it does seem like they were close, but grappling with and so I keep calling him a brother. He has a cousin who was raised with him, and he usually just calls him his brother. And he got married that summer of 1924. And I would love to know what that was like. What's the conversation with the bride's family? Like, I know that I think they canceled their honeymoon, obviously, but it's just like, what was that? Oh my gosh.
Well, at some point, I know in the book, they changed their name.
Yes, the Leopold family, it was after Nathan Sr. died, and I still don't know why. I still have not seen an explanation, but sometime in the early 30s, his remaining two brothers changed their last name from Leopold to Lebold, which is similar enough, but like, I guess it's not an immediate. And I know the one, Sam, who had kids, I think he didn't want them growing up with that name, because he was, just in his letters, he's worried a lot about that, about the shame to the kids, the shame to the family, and the stigma. So yeah, it definitely had ramifications for all of the families that they're still feeling today.
Oh, if the glasses had not been dropped, do you think they would have been caught?
I do not, because the glasses are what got people interested, like what made them not interested, but like connected them to Leopold. He did go in for questioning once before they connected him to the glasses, because he frequented the area. but he was not under suspicion. It was just like, hey, who else comes around here? That kind of thing. And they questioned hundreds of people during that time. I really, without the glasses, I don't see anything else connecting him because I just don't like all the other evidence that they have comes from already having him. Like they wouldn't have known from the chauffeur that they had, they wouldn't have given this alibi. They wouldn't have known they connected them through the typewriter and specifically like, okay, it was this kind of typewriter. And then they go to his house and they find these things and they go to his study group and they find these typewritten pages that prove it was the same typewriter. But if they didn't already have Leopold, I don't see a way of them connecting unless it was like they did a house by house neighborhood search or something like that.
Yeah. It seems like one of those things like on like Law and Order or something, if they decided to exclude glasses, then everything else gets excluded.
Yeah, and maybe I'm wrong, but that's to my knowledge, I don't think there's a way that they could have otherwise,
Yeah. Okay, another great question. How did the political radicalism of the era fit into Leopold's life and or the incident?
I would love to know that too, because there's one account that says, well, there's a few accounts that say they were kind of in Bohemia, that they would go to these radical parties and they would talk about these concepts and these crazy new ideas and that helped form their philosophy. But they're not from really reliable sources. And I haven't found anything. I don't have a lot of sources from before the murder that are not just Leopold talking about his own life, which he's not going to talk about that. So that is fascinating. I would love to know, like, what his connection was, if he even was thinking about any of these things. I would love to know if he had any thoughts about like gay rights and like, did he ever make contact with other gay people in Chicago at the time? Did he ever have, because it's really interesting too, because Loeb's family was extremely like socially relevant. Like they hosted lectures on everything, on Palestine and women's suffrage and like topical things. They were always hosting lectures in their house about these things. And it's like, so I know Loeb was at least around it, but I don't know about Leopold, and I also don't know if Loeb cared. So they would have been exposed in some capacity, but how much went in, I don't know.
Right. What was the biggest challenge you faced writing this book?
I think the biggest challenge, honestly, was that I had so much information. And it's like, how do I even do anything other than tell people everything? How do I exclude stuff? What do I exclude? And how do I even make a narrative out of this? That was really the hardest part. And then, like, people don't like long books these days. And so my publisher they actually wanted 80,000 words, which I did not do. But they wanted it a lot shorter than I did. And so that was a huge challenge of like, I want to include this story, this detail, this, I would love to write a 1,000-page biography of him. So that was definitely the hardest part for me, just cutting it down.
And I'll say, and Jeannie and I were talking about this too. I mean, it's so well researched, but it is also just so eminently readable, which does not, those two don't always go together.
No, they don't. That's true. I'm glad you found it that way.
It's just, I mean, yeah, it just, I'm taking up too much time gushing because we've got a few more questions and we've got 10 more minutes. Could you talk about the relevancy of the Leopold and Loeb incident today?
I think there's still the issue. I think it would be more of a kind of a criminal justice style issue of like, especially these people who, if it's a 1-to-1, if they had been committing crimes for 4 years before they'd gotten caught and they never get caught, and what's happening to them? What's happening that these very privileged guys are not getting caught for things? What's happening that they are able to afford all these lawyers, which was also, it was also talked about at the time. But I think the wealth would be a really big thing. I'm also afraid that the Jewishness would also be a big thing because of the times we're living in. I feel like a lot of anti-Semitic people would get out there and try to use this case as a bad example. I think that would, and it's fascinating because at the time, their Jewishness is so rarely mentioned in the press, and it's people know that it is. And like it's the same thing with their sexuality, not mentioned in the press that often. But when people write letters, they know they're Jewish, they know that they were in a sexual relationship, and it's very interesting how these things kind of like are able to get in there under the radar. But nowadays, it would not be under the radar. It would be extreme. I think there would also be from the LGBT community of bad representation and from the other side of like, this is why gay people are dangerous because anti-Semitism and being anti-LGBT are both on the rise right now. So I think we would see way more of that than we saw in 1924.
So returning to the earlier question about, the challenges, and then your publisher wanted a certain length. This question says, this leads to my question, was there an anecdote that you left out that you regret not including?
There's not one that I can think off the top of my head, but 100% yes, there definitely were. Yeah, there's not one that I can call to mind, but I would love to do an extended version and kind of tell more. And I know a lot of people aren't interested in his later life, but that really interests me. And like, I just want like a list of all the conferences he went to. Like, look, you guys, look at how much he was doing. Look at how accepted he was with all of these people. That's not super interesting, but I would love to include that kind of like and he's like, oh, and I'm lecturing at this university today, and then I'm going to go over here and lead this church group in this thing, and then I'm going to go over here and I'm going to take this, I'm going to pick up a couple of hustlers off the beach and we're going to a hotel room, like all in the same day. Like I would love to try to get more of the specific details of that in.
So Erik, what is your next project?
I don't have anything planned at the moment. I am tossing around the idea of doing a book about the fictional adaptations of this case, because as I said, there's like over 100, and they're in like every format imaginable. There's an interpretive dance and a musical and a ballet and an opera and songs and poems, and there's just so much, and it changes over time what people care about, how they're represented. Just this week, I got access to a 1953 Australian radio play that's the case, and it's just fascinating. Like they inspired an issue of Spider-Man, like one of the comics, and it's just, I love that kind of stuff. Like that would be a book for me. Just maybe I would be the only one who read it, but I would have a blast. So, but I don't see myself as an author. Like I wrote this book just because I was interested in it. I started researching to know more about this. I had no plans to write a book. And so there's nothing else, like nothing non-Leopold Loeb related that I'm that interested in. And I would never want to, because I've spent a lot of time. I would not want to treat writing a book like a job. I would want it to be something that just consumed me, that I was super interested in. And I don't have anything else like that right now. So
we've got another question. What's your favorite Clarence Darrow trial? Was it this one?
I actually don't know that much about Clarence Darrow. I would say it's this one, but Scopes is probably more interesting, really. I feel like that might be more interesting as a trial, and it's got bigger ramifications for everything. So I feel like Scopes might be, but I don't know much about Darrow. He's an interesting guy. It's funny, people kind of like, I feel like people aggrandize him a lot, but it's like, he did get arrested for bribing a jury in California, and he was not allowed to practice law in California anymore. And he like constantly cheated on his wife, and he was fascinating. He's a very intelligent
Mhm,
person, a very good speaker. But I'm like, was he perfect? Maybe
mhm,
not. Maybe he was a human.
yeah,
But yeah, I don't have a good answer because I haven't studied a lot of Darrow.
and that's fair. And I think might be our last question. And it's a great question. Hi, Erik. Jason here from Northwestern Special Collections.
Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for your help.
I appreciate how strictly you based your conjecture on the extant evidence, especially given your obvious passion for the whole story. How does this speak to your understanding of the role of the biographer?
Oh, well, again, Jason, super helpful. He's an archivist at Northwestern. He's helped me so much. Um, but there's a quote that I read because I read a lot of books about writing biographies before I kind of started writing my own. And it's like, you have an ocean of material, and your book is a bucket, and you have to just get the perfect amount in that bucket that will tell the story, that will be representative of the ocean. And it's impossible, but that's what you have to do to try. And it was very important to me not to editorialize as little as possible because you have to. Your opinion's going to go into it.
Mhm.
But there's such a trend of creative nonfiction these days, and there's a lot of it in Leopold Loeb books and other nonfiction Leopold Loeb books where they make up conversations and they make up what people are thinking. And I do not like that in my nonfiction.
Mhm.
I wanted to, everything that I saw, I wanted it to come from the archive. And I wanted to kind of like, okay, I know you really like this theory, but
Mhm.
is it being represented? Are you looking for evidence to support your theory, or are you looking at the evidence and then drawing a theory? And I was I really tried as hard as I could to, kind of let the evidence tell me what was happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, as I said, it's just so well researched and well written. It's just I I've worked at CHM 11 years and had no idea all of this.
It's all in and
I
that's
know.
the crazy thing. There's been so many books about Leopold and Loeb, and none of them have used that collection, that his personal papers. I give the one from 1975 a pass because they weren't open at that point. They had to wait till 5 years after his death. Everybody else, what's wrong with you? His personal papers are there. Oh my gosh, use the material.
Oh, I'll take advantage of our 2 more minutes, and I will. What do you think? As a very personal question, what do you think led him to say my papers need to go to the Chicago Historical Society, and I am important enough a person that my papers need to go there?
Oh, well, he had a very, high opinion of himself. But actually, several of his friends had been trying to get him, like encouraged him to do. His lawyer, Elmer Gertz, donated to Northwestern and the Library of Congress
Mhm.
regularly, like since the 60s. He was donating his own papers. Harold Rao, who's the member of the Brethren,
Mhm.
who what he was closest to, he really encouraged him to donate. Um, I think he actually encouraged him specifically to donate to CHM or CHS as it was at the time. I don't know why they chose. I mean, I understand why it would be in a Chicago institution, and I guess that was the place. If it was going to be anywhere, it was going to be at the History Museum because that's history. And so much of his case, and eventually what got when he sued Meyer Levin, it was what
Mhm.
kind of ruined that for him is that he is a public figure. His
Mhm.
case is a part of the story of public life in Chicago. And I'm glad that he donated. I'm glad that he
Oh,
thought
yeah.
it was important enough because I agree,
Oh gosh, we're at 6:59. When Erik and Jeannie and I were emailing about this, we could have gone for hours. Unfortunately, we will give everyone their evening back, but we are thrilled to have you join us tonight, Erik. And everyone had such great questions, and seeing thank you for this wonderful program and applause. Thank you. Yes, Erik. Oh, this is amazing. Everyone,
Thank you
read
so
this
much,
book.
everybody. Read the book. You can go to my website. My email's there if you want to talk more, if you want to ask questions. There's no subject I love talking about more. So
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great to see you and talk to you. Thank you, everybody who came by. Thank you for your questions. It was lovely.
We loved it. Such a gruesome topic, but we loved it.
I know.
Okay, night, everyone. Thank you.